With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. And you know, something that I think everyone is familiar with, that which is what we very often repeat in the tradition, is to keep in mind, whatever we're doing in terms of practice or study, that we're doing this with an awareness of the value of this, not just for ourselves, but for all beings. We're not doing this as a personal quest for enlightenment, but very much with an awareness that our confusion is very much based on a diluted understanding of me and other. And the moment that we are pursuing the path of enlightenment, we're actually gradually getting over this confused projection and allowing to connect with a greater reality that extends beyond this, you could say, personal misunderstanding of our reality. And that's where naturally the quality of awakening is compassion. But for that to happen, then we have a very clear path. And this is the wonderful thing about what the Buddha offered to us, really, is that there's a clear methodology about how to pursue this. So presently we are studying the Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is, if you like, a pith instruction from one of the great Buddhist masters, who also, coming from a place of enlightenment, identified what is required really for us to pursue enlightenment. And that's where one of the really important aspects of that is cultivating what we call the awakened heart, or bodhicitta. This inspiration that enlightenment is something that we naturally possess. We just need to align ourselves with that nature. And one of the basic aspects of that is really the thought of other, to be conscious of the suffering of the world and to be dedicated to others. And this again is where we have then what we call the vow of the Bodhisattva, the commitment to awakening, very much keeping in mind the inspiration or the intention to do this for others. And so we take this vow, and then presently we're looking at the 9th chapter in Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is about how do we apply this? How do we integrate this vow of awakening? And that's where this centers around two aspects. One is the intention, which we've covered. The other is the application. And the application aspect of this, what we call the bodhicitta of application, is very much centered around what we call the 6 paramitas. The 6, you could say, practices that take us beyond our ordinary, you could say, zone of confusion. And we've looked at generosity. Now we're looking at discipline. Now, discipline is something which, for the modern person, is a bit of a sort of an unknown element, even though we actually do know it, because whenever we need to actually do something, we need to have the discipline to follow through. But when it comes to spiritual discipline, then we're often thinking of the spiritual as something that will just sort of come somehow, but it actually requires a very structured methodology and approach that really is very, very practical. And one of the really practical and visibly practical aspects of Buddhism is the monastic approach. Now, I don't think anybody here in this room or in this Zoom room is a monastic, even though actually I do have friends that are monastics that sometime are here. But as we can see, Buddhism in the modern world generally has a lot to do with the path of the layperson. But it's also good for us to appreciate the intricacy and the, you could say, very serious nature of the monastic ordination. And this is not, the monastic ordination is never just sort of, you could say, rules for the sake of rules, but it's really just providing a structure for what is helpful for our spiritual path. And so, for example, if we go and study medicine at university, we're going to have to do it with discipline. We're going to have to actually, you know, we could spend a lot of time partying while we're at the university, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to actually really allocate some serious time to our studies. And that's where we inevitably come across this practice of slightly monastic practices, such as isolating ourselves, focusing, and so forth, and setting some limits to what it is that we need to do. So with the monastic approach in Buddhism, there's a lot of rules, and like I say, we're mostly lay people, but it's kind of good to know what the monastics actually, what it is that constitutes a monastic. So when you see a monastic, and if you're in Tibetan Buddhism, it's very likely that you'll encounter one or two. Then, you know, respect for what they actually uphold. That's why, you know, when we take refuge in the Sangha. And the Sangha is, to a large extent, the monastics. Of course, also we have the Sangha of Bodhisattvas. But the Sangha of monastics is very big. If you look at the Buddhist civilizations that we have in this world, a lot of monastics. So all that said, then, let's have a look at that, which is presently, let's see here, I think we're 47, stanza 47, yeah. So here it says, and this is, again, this is a little bit difficult for me because I'm not a monastic myself. And also as we saw last time also, there's some very particular practices that apply to the men and very particular practices that apply to the women. So presently we're looking at the practices of the women. So that's where it says then in stanza 47, for bhikkhunis, 364 acts must be shunned. 8 radical defeats, which are 4 specific ones, are added to the 4 already mentioned. To these are added wrongful acts and different species of related misdemeanors, such as incomplete infractions. So we'll look at the Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary for this. It says here, the fully ordained nun or bhikkhuni must observe 364 precepts of renunciation. In addition to the 4 radical defeats common to both monks and nuns, the bhikkhuni must avoid 4 specific defeats. She must not touch a man. She must not lie on her back in the presence of a man. She must not conceal the faults of another nun, and she must not try, either physically or verbally, to prevent another nun from being reinstated into the Sangha after a proper confession has been made. Buddhist nuns must therefore guard against 8 root defeats. Following this, there are 20 residual faults, 33 downfalls requiring rejection, 180 mere downfalls, 11 faults requiring specific confession, and 112 wrong actions. All these come to 364 things to be rejected. In addition to all this, there are many different kinds of related faults and infractions, common to fully ordained monks and nuns, in which all the karmic conditions are not operative when they are committed. Now we need to, this is where then, as it then speaks about in the notes here, which has to do with there are some vows which are the karmic conditions, meaning you could say you undertake something that is, you know, breaking the vow in one way or another. But then if all the conditions are not there, that's where in the practice, in the section on karma, it speaks about how there has to be the object, there has to be an intention, there has to be the act, and there has to be the satisfaction of having completed the act, for there really to be the full impact, karmic impact. And this is, of course, again, where it applies. Let's say somebody does something that's, you could say, according to the rules, wrong, but then immediately regrets it. Then there's not all the conditions are there. So that's where we need to understand again the complexity of karma. Now, we have to keep one thing in mind, that everything that applies with the ordained Sangha has to do with vows that they take. This is something one takes voluntarily. This is not something that where it says, like, to be a good Buddhist, then you have to, take all these vows. Not at all. It's simply just for the particular individual that might apply that this is seen as something helpful. And in that case, you could say you commit to that particular discipline. But that's particular then to the monks and nuns. And that's, again, doesn't really apply to us if we're lay people. But at the same time, for us to hear this gives us some respect. So then 48 and 49 reads, through the defeats, the ordination is completely lost. The intention to conceal the fault or not determines the criterion whereby the vows may later be repaired. It is indeed amazing that some claim to keep the vows and yet are ignorant of what they should be keeping. Through just the knowledge of the downfalls, it is easy to restore and purify the vows. So that's where, when there is a breakage of vows, unless it's what we call something that completely ends the ordination, then vows can be repaired. But then again, it's important that one doesn't conceal it. And then, of course, it applies that if one commits to this, and this is where this is not likely so much to happen in our culture, but sometimes in terms of cultural practices. Let's say that your family wants you to become unordained, a monastic. Then you might just take the vows, but you're not actually aware of what they involve. And that, of course, is what Kangyur Rinpoche then will say here. This is a disgrace. So he comments, the 4 or 8 radical defeats entail the complete loss of the ordination. Whether this can be subsequently restored depends on whether there was the intention to conceal the fault. So let's say something really goes wrong and one commits something which is definitely against the ordination. If one then wants, one is it can happen. And of course, this can be on the basis of passion. There's one beautiful sutra, which is called the Sutra of the Purification of Karmas. And in there, there's a monk who falls in love and has a brief fling with a woman. And then immediately goes back to the Buddha and says, gosh, I lost it for a moment, and I've not exactly upheld my celibacy. It's very interesting. There, the Buddha actually says, oh yeah, well, go and talk to Manjushri, he says. And then he goes and speaks with Manjushri, and Manjushri just talks about the emptiness of things and how there's no such a thing as, inherently true actions and so forth. And completely just talks from the point of view of prajna, of wisdom, and doesn't at all worry about whether there was some breakage of the vows. So that's where you can see there's every reason to be honest. That's the thing. There's this monk is completely honest and goes to the Buddha. He doesn't like try to hide away and just says, this is what happened. And that's where it can be, that's where the vows can be reinstated. So then it says, but it is essential that there's this honesty. And so that this is laid down in the Vinaya. It is consequently disconcerting to come across shamaneras or even fully ordained monks and nuns who claim to be upholding the precepts correctly, but yet are ignorant even of the names of the 5 classes of downfall. So I wouldn't be able to, I can't just now remember this. It's probably explained somewhere here. So this is a bit embarrassing, but this not being part of my own sort of discipline. But anyway, these are important. If this is something that you're practicing, then of course, then you need to really completely know this. So not knowing it, Kangyur Rinpoche says, such people are, well, Jigme Lingpa says it, such people are a disgrace. The thing is also that in traditional context, the monastics are really an object of respect. They receive, you can say they're looked after. So to be objects of veneration, and one would say making offerings to the Sangha means that we're sharing in their merit. So that's where if if persons are ordained and the object of veneration, and they actually don't even know what they're doing, then that is disgraceful. So that's why Kangyur Rinpoche then says to say that they are ordained is like pointing to some dry earth and calling it a well, meaning dry earth doesn't contain the water. It might be objected that given that they do not abide by the precepts, there is hardly any point in their knowing what they are, meaning it's pointless. They don't know what it is, so they don't care about it. So that's, you do have, if you go to monastic communities, then there are occasionally sort of what you would call loafers, just people who are hanging around and not doing anything, just, essentially eating the handouts from them being ordained. So you could say, well, it would be no point for them to knowing all the vows since they don't care about it anyway. And then the Kangyur Rinpoche says, then true enough, but ignorance can never be justified. This is actually, we have the same in our legal system, you get stopped by the police and you're driving 30 kilometers too fast. You can't say, oh, I'm sorry, officer, I didn't know. That's not going to help. So it says here, to be aware of what the downfalls are and to understand how reparation might be made is what makes purification possible. And Asanga himself has said, of the 4 doors to transgression, ignorance is the most serious. So I think let me see what the footnote says. The 4 doors that lead to transgression are ignorance of the precepts, lack of respect for them, negligence, and an excess of defiled emotions. It is obviously impossible to respect and observe what one is ignorant of. So again, this goes just like you could say the rules, like the traffic rules, not knowing the traffic rules, not caring about the traffic rules, being negligent about the traffic rules, and getting all excited. All of these make any rules impossible to uphold. Okay, so 50. And it says, the precepts to be implemented are the rituals of the 3 foundations and those of 17 precepts that remain. This is the discipline of things to be adopted. So the precepts concerning what is to be done. According to the teaching, there are 3 basic rituals to be performed. The ritual of restoration and purification, the ritual of the summer retreat, and the ritual for ending the summer retreat. So these are something that we come across when we can observe the monastics, and we would see that they have a ritual of actually restoring the vows. And that's where, again, this is the beautiful thing about the Buddhist teaching is that, yes, you want to train yourself at a certain level, but of course, to begin with, it's very difficult. And that's where it's to be expected that you might not, you might not be able to do this, but it's not the end of the day. You just, you start over again. And then you have what's called the rainy retreat, because in India and in Asia, you had the monsoon. So you have that ritual of those 3 months, and then you have a particular ritual for ending that retreat. So there's a fair bit of commentary here where it says, and there are 3 basic rituals. Let's see here. No, I'm going to pass on that because there's a lot of commentary on that by Kangyur Rinpoche. But basically, yes, there are these 3. And the first of this is then, in Tibetan, it's called sojong, which means to repair and purify. And let's say there's some footnote here. Sojong, uposatha, the ritual of restoration and purification refreshes the remedial force of virtue and cleanses all faults. So this happens in the monastic context twice a month. So it says here, this ritual is of 2 kinds. The first, which is called calm abiding, Shinike Sojong, purifies the obscurations accumulated in the past and perfects the superior trainings in concentration and wisdom. So that would basically mean simply meditation. you haven't kept your vows perfectly, the first thing you want to do is then establish peace of mind. The second is called concordant, where it says Tumpe Sojong, whereby wrongdoing is avoided in the present life and the training in discipline is kept pure. The former refers to the practice of shamatha and vipassana meditation, while the latter consists of a ritual of formal confession. And this is then where when this happens in monasteries, the monastics gather in the main temple, which is called the gathering hall, and they close the door. Us non-monastics, we can't get in. And what they do is actually private business. And while it might get a bit ritualized sometimes, it is actually a time when they're supposed to then say, well, they're not supposed to eat afternoon. And they might say, oh, I actually couldn't help it. I snacked, one night, or I was a naughty boy and I did some naughty things, or whatever it might be. They actually expose these to each other, and they expose them to the elders. And then, of course, there's the notion that, yes, okay, you've exposed it, you've told, you've been honest, then, basically, then it's sort of like you tell what you've done, and then you get on with it. It's not like it lingers. And that's where, on one hand, you have this sort of amendment in the sense that you expose this to the others, and particularly to the elders, but then also then it's clean, then it's done. You don't sort of hang on to it. You don't the guilt doesn't linger as such. Anyway, that's where here then Jürgen Gyatso says, this again is of two kinds. First, the ritual performed regularly on the 14th or 15th of the lunar month. That's what I was just talking about. And second, the private confession performed when and as necessary as means of receiving blessing and in order to avert calamities and foster harmony in the Sangha. So that's why one then does this privately. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the sort of Opus Dei practices of self-flagellation or whatever. It's simply just sort of being honest. So then it says here, so that's the first one, the ritual of restoration and purification. The ritual of the summer retreat. Okay, so this is where, due to the monsoon and so on, actually it's interesting, why it's during the monsoon, there's a lot of reasons for it, but one of them actually is also there's a lot of teeming life out there. So if you're, in India, then there's little bugs everywhere. So there's simply there's just a lot more animals to step on. So that's where, to keep yourself out of trouble, then you just stay in retreat for that time. Of course, also for spiritual reasons. So this is called Yarne in Tibetan. And here it says, Jürgen Gyatso says, the traditional summer retreat begins either on the 15th day of the 6th lunar month and finishes 3 months later, or on the 15th day of the 9th month, or else it lasts and finishes the 15th of the 9th month, or else it lasts from the 15th day of the 7th month to the 15th of the 10th month. So these are 3 months. Now, I should say also in the Tibetan tradition, I think they have a sort of they have a summer retreat light version. I think they just do. I think that sometimes they only do 6 weeks. And then the ritual for ending the summer retreat. Let's see what this says here. The ritual that concludes the summer retreat must be performed, even when the retreat is interrupted by external circumstances. It marks the lifting of all restrictions imposed during the summer retreat. Okay. All in all, there are 17 precepts that form the basis of the 3 trainings. These have been set out in the Vinaya Vastu in the form of a mnemonic. It says, okay, taking ordination, ritual of restoration and purification, retreat in summer months, the lifting of the same, wearing fur and leather, medicine and clothing, giving out of robes, kaushambi, or the smoothing of divisions, procedural formalities and castigation for the orange-clad, rules for individuals and demotion, suspension from confession, and rules for living space, the settling of dispute, the healing of divisions, Okay. Okay. So the 17 regulations to here cover ordination, and that is also, by the way, ordination is also quite complex. So, but anyway, that's a big deal. That's where you become then a monastic. Then to ritual of restoration and purification, as we just saw, summer retreat, as we just saw, its concluding ritual, as we just saw, the prohibition of use of fur and leather. That's normally not done, but then again, there are ways around it. The rules for nourishment and the practice of medicine. Again, we'll see there are ways around this. The proper color and style of the robes. The so-called katina practice, namely the making of distribution of the robes and so on. The practice of kaushambi, or the smooth pacification of divisions. 10 other prescribed formalities, of which there are more than 100. 11, the imposition of discipline for the orange-clad. In other words, the forceful settling of problems and the imposition of punishment for indiscipline. 12, the dealing with cases of indiscipline on the individual level, the problems of how to deal with breaches of conduct, penances given for faults confessed, and excommunication for faults upheld. 13, the demotion in monastic rank for serious infractions and failure to attend the ritual of restoration and purification. 14, regulations regarding suspension from the restoration and purification ritual. 15, rules connected with dwelling places. And finally, the settling of quarrels. And 17, the healing of divisions. Okay. Now, you might think this is excessive, but I can tell you, if you operate within a corporate context, this exactly the same actually applies. You know, it just takes on different forms, you know, in terms of rules and also the consequences and so on. So we shouldn't be too sort of puzzled about this. Anyway, then the commentary here from Kangyur Rinpoche says, training in these precepts constitutes the discipline of what has to be implemented. So then in 51 it says, accepting 17's transgressions, 4 defeats and faults that are residual, when something untoward must need to be done, it must be blessed. And so, if food be taken at improper times, one thinks that one is dwelling in the northern continent. Well, this gets a slightly bit funny, but anyway. If it happens in the course of observing the precepts that one is called upon to do something that is not normally allowed, this does not include actions evil by the nature, such as killing of animals or the 17 major transgressions of the rule, namely the 4 radical defeats and the 13 residual faults, the action must be blessed. This is sort of like, if you have to do something that really falls outside of the rules, then there has to be ways of actually, you could say, getting around this. There's ways to do this. For example, if one is obliged to eat at an improper time of the day, one considers that one is an inhabitant of the northern continent of Uttara Kuru, where people are naturally endowed with discipline. So this is where then there's a story about this. But I remember once one of my ordained friends, you know, was invited out, and you know, people had actually prepared a dinner for this person, and this person is actually somebody who keeps this vow of not eating at night. Many Tibetan monks actually do eat at night, but this guy, he actually didn't. And I remember him telling the story about this. You know, you think that you think something about how to handle this. It's kind of funny. And says here, this is an allusion to the fact that the inhabitants of the northern continent have all that they could possibly wish. They are therefore free of craving. So that means as you're then eating, you're actually doing this without any attachment. So here the commentary says, if a monk, and also the nun, does this, he or she is permitted to eat. For it is said that once, when the Buddha was in Koshala, a large group of merchants offered him and the monastic community a meal. The meal was prepared and the monks were summoned, but just as they were about to eat, a fire broke out in the merchants' shops. So the host's shop was on fire. Everyone ran to put out the blaze, and so it happened that the time for the midday meal passed by. So it was sort of afternoon by the time they had put out the fire. The monks turned to the Lord, meaning the Buddha, and asked what they should do. "O monks," the Buddha replied, "don't hesitate, just eat your meal. But as you eat, bless this moment as if you were in the northern continent of Uttarakuru." So there you go. So 52 and 53. So too, when bathing, one must think that one is sick, and when constrained to wear additional or improper clothing, white in color, made of skin or fur, one keeps in mind that without such materials, one would be at great loss. Wherefore, such things are sanctioned as a mean to save one's life. So that's why sometimes you do see, lamas who wear what's it called, sheepskin, sheepskin coats. 53. If one is forced to handle precious substances, one thinks that this has been allowed for making offerings to the three jewels or to succor living beings, and as for what is neither banned nor yet permitted. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, in similar fashion, if one is obliged to bathe more often than twice a month, actually, in Tibet, famously, people wouldn't bathe a whole lot. But it's a bit interesting that actually also in India, they didn't bathe more than twice a month. I guess this was probably to not get too sort of caught up in the vanity of keeping personal hygiene. Anyway, it says here, if one was obliged to bathe more often than twice a month, one should regard oneself as ill and the bath as a medicinal cure for the disease. Likewise, if one needs to use extra clothes or garments that are of an inappropriate color, such as white, or of an improper material, such as leather or fur, one should be mindful that since there are no other possibilities, one would be completely deprived if one did not use them. It is then permissible to use such clothing in order to protect one's life and maintain the practice of virtue. So this is simply just practical remedies for either looking after oneself or simply just about, say, practical survival. Again, if it happens that one is constrained to touch or possess precious substances, one should consider that this is permissible as a means for making offerings to the three jewels and giving sustenance to others. So again, there is this rule that monastics actually shouldn't be touching money, which in principle is very good, but it's not always that practical, and that's why very often monastics do obviously carry money and so on. As for other things that do not clearly fall into the categories of what is specifically advocated or banned, the question of whether they are permitted is judged according to the degree to which they approximate or diverge from the spirit of the precepts. So, if one obviously breaks the vows, if it's something that you could say has a purpose, or there's it doesn't really go against the spirit of the precepts, then of course that's not that bad. And that is where one can then bless things according to what the particular situation is. The rules of all four monastic schools, Sarvastivada and Mahasangika, Stavira and Samija, cannot but be covered by the precepts of the Buddha. Each is therefore able to uphold the entire training. So regardless of whatever the tradition might be, this sort of applies to them all. It says then, after the Buddha's parinirvana, 18 Shravaka lineages came into existence. So these are then the monastics. So that we say there are 18 schools that emerged. 7 of these belong to the Sarvastivada school, the royal lineage of Rahula. So this is what we call an ordination lineage. So ordination lineage is actually where you have the ordination being passed on to some individuals that then successfully manage to uphold the particular regulations, the discipline, and so on. So that's where they actually then pass this on. And that's where, for example, initially in Tibet, before initially the Dharma was established in Tibet, they had what was called the seven men who were on trial. And these guys actually upheld properly the vows, and then the monastic lineage has actually continued uninterrupted down to the present day. So it's a lineage of individuals who have successfully upheld the ordination lineage. And that's why it is really important that there are actually, you can say there's lots of monks, but not everybody upholds the vows properly. But it's really important that there are some that perfectly uphold them. For example, upstairs we have a picture of Treasury Rinpoche. And Treasury Rinpoche was one of the great lamas in recent time. And we would say he was a perfect upholder of the monastic vows. And also we have another great upholder of the monastic vows, which was Taklong Sitro. So that's where for the monastic tradition to continue, there has to be an actual unbroken lineage. And this literally goes all the way back to the Buddha. But you have then, at the time of the Buddha, then different monastic lineages emerged. So the first one, and that's the one actually we have that came to Tibet, which is called the Sarvastivada. So this came from someone called Rahula, actually the Buddha's son. So that was 7 of them. 5 belonged to the Mahasanghika school, which is of the priestly lineage of Mahakashyapa, one of the Buddha, another student of the Buddha. Then there are 3 lineages of the Stavira school in the lineage of Katyayana, the arrow maker. That's one more. And the 3 lineages of the Samitra school in the lineage of the Baba Upali. So these were the different lineages that emerged. And yeah, let's see here. So it says here, Tamche Yepamao, the Sarvastivadins, the ones that hold that everything exists. This does not mean that they accepted the reality of everything, but only of 75 dharmas, which they regarded as ultimate in having permanent existence. So these various schools, they have their own particularities. For example, the Samitra school is quite famous because they actually say, well, there is a self. You know, the Buddha said, I am teaching, so he must have asserted a self. There's some and of course, when the school that you have in Tibet, that they say that something exists, you know, that only really applies up to you come to the place of Madhyamika, where they then would essentially establish that nothing actually has real existence. But we do say within what is then the Mahayanists called the Hinayana, which is here called the Shravakas, they actually assert there are certain things that have true existence. Anyway, that's a different discussion. But anyway, the Sarvastivada school, it says here, it was the Sarvastivada school of precepts, and that spread mainly in Tibet. Let's see what it says here. So this is just from the translators. It says here, with regards to the spread of the Sarvastivada in Tibet, Kyabje Dudrum Rinpoche says, the Vinaya tradition practiced in Tibetan Buddhism is that of Sarvastivada school, introduced to Tibet by Shantarakshita. The lineage began with the Buddha and was passed down through Shariputra, Rahula, also called Saraha, Nagarjuna, Bhavivika, and others. Following the persecution of Langdharma, the Vinaya lineage revived and spread again from the lowlands of Kham, and is for this reason called the Eastern Lowland lineage of the Vinaya, Medul. This lineage continues up to the day and is the system into which all Nyingmapas and most Gelugpas are ordained. So, of course, in Tibetan history, there was the initial establishment of Buddhism in Tibet, where the students, the monks who were the students of Shantarakshita, also known as the abbot, who was invited from India, who was a very venerable great master. And by the way, those of you who studied the course with Wilson Flesher on the Madhyamika Alamkara, this is the author. a very, very great Indian master who then came to Tibet. And he's the one who then had these 7 men on trial. And this lineage of ordained monks actually worked, and others were ordained, many others were ordained. But then you had this really tragic time where the sort of conservative forces in Tibet basically persecuted particularly the monks and nuns, and destroyed the monasteries, killing the monastics and so on. And a group of monks managed to escape to eastern Tibet. This was a king called Langdharma. He was, Buddhism was fairly new in Tibet at that stage, and there were a lot of conservative elements who were opposed to this sort of new thing from India. So that Buddhism was established for a couple of generations, but then this, you could say, backlash happened. And the monastics then were, to a large extent, actually exterminated. But some of them escaped to eastern Tibet. And that's where then the gradually, after things calmed down, this was actually the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, because what happened is, after a few years of this tyranny of this king called Langdharma, somebody assassinated him, and then you could say things calmed down and the monastics gradually came back into Tibet. But this was also the end of Tibet as a big, you could say, empire. The Tibet was very, very powerful and actually extended into parts of China. This is an interesting discussion, and you actually have places in Tibet where there's a pillar that commemorates the peace between the Tibetans and the Chinese, where it says that the Tibetans vow not to go beyond this limit, and the Chinese vow not to go beyond that limit. This is particularly relevant for present-day discussions about Tibetan autonomy. But anyway, the Vinaya lineage continued, but then in a different context. And just to say a little bit more about that historically, because what happened is, with the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, also it was the collapse of you could say, the great sponsorship from the government side in the centralized government-sponsored importation of Tibet actually ended at that time. The initial moment when Padmasambhava and Shantarakshita, under the, you could say, auspices of government sponsorship due to the King Trisondetsen, when they sort of, you could say, established Buddhism in Tibet, there was an enormous amount of translation that took place, and a lot of teaching took place. This is also where Padmasambhava taught what is known as the 25 disciples. And many of these were ordained, but also many of them were yogis, men and women. And it's at the time then of some generations later, then when the monasteries were destroyed, then the yogis, the tantrikas, they actually managed to survive simply because they were very powerful. And particularly one of them, Nupchen Sanjayeshe, he completely terrified the king Langdharma in various ways. But hence this really cruel, brutal king, he left all the yogis alone. And what then followed was, in central Tibet, where all of this took place, the lineage, which gradually began to include the monastics, nevertheless was mainly upheld on family basis, on yogis that were married. And so the first sort of following generations of Buddhism in Tibet was transmitted by yogis who were essentially married lay people, but who taught their children. And this was then passed on through several generations. It's only much later that Tibet became very monastic. So then what followed then was that there was a second wave of importation of Buddhism, which came from Western Tibet at the time of Atisha. So we had these two sort of waves of establishment of Buddhism in Tibet. So then it says here, how the three kinds of vows may be observed simultaneously. Let's just see, there's a footnote. Oh, this is a longer piece. Okay, how the three kinds of vows may be observed simultaneously. So stanza 55. The higher discipline is dedicated to the state beyond all suffering. The Bodhisattva vow affects the benefit of others. Receiving true empowerment, one takes the mantra vow. The precepts of these three, when performed, when perfected, when perfectly observed, give rise to all the many perfect qualities. So this is where we have this interesting phenomenon where monks have one level of you could say discipline, which is called the pratimoksha, individual liberation. In addition to that, you then have the bodhisattva vow, which is not necessarily monastics, but which can be monastics. And that's essentially that's no longer just about individual liberation. That's again the bodhisattva commitment to all beings. And finally, we have the Vajrayana approach, which is again another way of engaging with enlightenment, because from the Vajrayana perspective, enlightenment is already present. And you have the Vajrayana yoga, which is about integrating the vision of enlightenment already now. So we call this the resultant vehicle, in the sense that it's the vehicle that applies when one has eliminated confusion. So even when one hasn't eliminated confusion and one is just an ordinary person, one nevertheless recognizes that enlightenment is there, even though we might not see it. And that's where, on the basis of empowerment, the teacher is saying, you might not know this, but you actually are a Buddha. And please try to uphold that vision. So that's where you then have a different kind of discipline. So these three kinds of discipline, they actually can be upheld together. So here the commentary from Kangyur Rinpoche says, the Tibetan translation of the term nirvana literally means to pass beyond suffering. Here, suffering refers to the miseries of samsara, the cause of which is karma and defiled emotion. To pass beyond such causes severs the continuum of suffering and is the supreme level of peace or nirvana. This state of enlightenment is the goal of all true pratimoksha, a discipline which is thus superior to any ethical observance, the object of which is simply the happiness of the higher realms. So, of course, in all human societies, we have ethics as something that enables us to live together and to have happiness on the basis of our coexistence, but also when we look at, you could say, spiritual aspects, ethics is what enables us to basically go to heaven. You know, if you're a good boy or girl, you go to heaven. What happens when you die is not a mystery. It's actually the result of whatever you've done in this life. So that's the ordinary form of ethical observance. But in the case of the pratimoksha, that's where the objective is not just future happiness and future lives, but it's actually to achieve nirvana. So that's why it says this goes beyond just simply the happiness of the higher realms. No worries. In addition to upholding the pratimoksha, one wishes to attain perfect enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others on a vast scale. And if one duly takes the vows of bodhicitta in aspiration and action, according to either the two traditions of vast activities and profound view, one then becomes a holder of the vow of bodhicitta. So that's what we're personally discussing here in the context of the Bodhisattva vow. And there you have then two traditions of Bodhisattva vows, or two lineages that you have in the Indo-Tibetan tradition. Actually, sometimes people talk of a third lineage that went to China, which is really interesting. And that's the foundation for what we call Chan Buddhism or Zen. But anyway, you have these two traditions, vast activity, which is associated with a Sangha, and then profound view that is associated with Nagarjuna. So these are the two what we call Bodhisattva lineages. The one that went to China, interestingly, also actually comes through Nagarjuna. And that's the one then that, like I said, this is the basis for Chan Buddhism. Anyway, it says here, in addition to these two vows of the Bodhisattva, it says then, furthermore, one may, with a high motivation of benefiting others, receive empowerment according to the Mantrayana rituals, which express the perfect view of the great classes of Tantra. So that's where in the Vajrayana then, we have this practice of empowerment, where the approach is not only that you gradually will get there on the basis of your discipline, I mean, this also applies, but also the perspective that enlightenment is already present. And that's where we would say the entrance door to the Vajrayana is empowerment. And then this, you could say, practices of yoga, of abiding by this vision, is then expressed in various ways. There's various styles of practicing this. And that's what we then refer to as the classes of Tantra. This is a whole different sort of, you could say, theme. And in fact, the Treasury of Precious Qualities is divided into two volumes. And the second volume is entirely dedicated actually to the topic of the discipline and the practice of the path of Tantra. But anyway, in this way, we have these three levels of vows. There's Pratimoksha, there's the Bodhisattva, and there's the Tantric or Mantrayana approach. So it says, thus one receives the authentic Mantrayana vow of the Vijayadharas. This is, in turn, the foundation of the profound practice of the generation and perfection stages. Now, many of you would be familiar with the practice of, say, visualization of deity, and that we would call the generation stage. This always comes together with a very important aspect, which is called the perfection stage. And that's actually dissolving it. And that is where we can engage with the point of reference as this being deity, as you could say, sacred nature of our reality. But we don't get stuck on that and we dissolve it. So it has that dimension also of this being without any ultimate inherent reality. And of course, everything that we do on the Buddhist path is simply familiarizing ourselves that our reality cannot be grasped. And so any method that we have on the Buddhist path is always accompanied by this insight into wisdom, which understands how phenomena ultimately have no, you could say, ultimate true existence as we think it. And thus you have these two stages in tantric practice, which is one is the acknowledgement and the recognition of the purity of our relative perceptions. And the other is the relinquishment of any conceptual reference point. Anyway, this is a big topic, but just briefly, since it's mentioned here, the empowerment that we receive on the path of the Mantrayana then is very much associated with this practice of generation and perfection stage. So, voila, we have these three levels then. A person who takes all three kinds of vow, the pratimoksha, the monastic, the bodhisattva vow, and the Mantrayana vows, and someone who observes their many precepts concerning actions to be adopted or forsaken, as they are explained according to each level, will achieve all the qualities of the path and fruit. So that's where, again, we understand causation, as it has with everything. If you prepare things in a particular way, if you follow a recipe, you might think, oh my God, I can't make gratin, or I can't make, whatever it might be. then if you just follow the recipe, you actually be surprised. There you have all of a sudden made this dish. So similarly, also according to the recipe or the discipline of the path, one attains the path and fruit. Okay. Any questions from the live studio audience? No? Okay. Right. Let's see, any questions from the people in the Zoom room? Now I'll just check if there's any. Yes, in the chat, I think there's a couple of questions. Is there any purification of thoughts? Well, yes, there is actually. On the relative level, when we have thoughts that are contaminated by, you could say, our neurosis, our kleshas, our afflictions, then there is actually the practice of purification. And that's where whatever practice we might be doing, whatever discipline we might have, there are then ways of purifying thoughts. Again, it applies what we call 4 powers. One is the presence of, you could say, a witness. In the monastic context that we described here, you have this bi-monthly practice of simply, confessing to others. And in the Vajrayana, then we practice Vajrasattva. We practice considering that our teacher is there as witness, but in the form of Vajrasattva. Vajrasattva embodying, you could say, the purity of reality. But that's there when that's the power of, you could say, witness or support. Then we have the power of regret, actually regretting that we have these. Then you have the power of vow, actually being determined not to repeat this. And then the practice, actually integrating this. Now, of course, it might be difficult to have this for every single negative thought that arises throughout the day. So that's where, of course, if we can, every time it happens, stop up and sort of do a purification ritual, that's great. But we normally wouldn't do it. And we would more sort of just practically speaking, it's always said that at the end of the day, we would look at how have we actually been handling ourselves. And really, if there have been moments of serious aggression or serious, you could say, toxic moments, then we actually practice Vajrasattva. And, if you're familiar with Vajrasattva practice, we would say then to do some Vajrasattva practice at the end of the day. And most of us do this anyway, as simply part of the fact that we inevitably have all sorts of toxic moments. Can you speak more on the Samkhya school and their belief in the self? Not a whole lot. I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not very familiar with it, but I remember in the context of the Madhyamika teachings, where we generally would say that all Buddhist traditions actually say there is no self, which is perfectly legitimate since we're a new person every moment. First of all, we're constituted by both mind and body. And where do we find a solid self, either in the body or in the mind? But nevertheless, we do have this enduring sense of me, me, me. And it's to that extent of our attachment to that we actually have suffering. So all the Buddhist teachings, they actually talk about dependent arising as the understanding that this assumption around a solid self is flawed. So that's a given. But there is one school that actually would hold on to, and they're seen as a little bit of an anomaly. They're sort of the only Buddhist school that actually say, no, there is a self. The Buddha taught it. But the thing is, when you hear that, it's very often a rough generalization. And I'm sure if you go and really look into the Samkhya school, they will have some justification for that. Traditionally, one would say, oh yeah, the Samkhyas, they hold on to the belief in the self because the Buddha, he said, I am the Buddha, I have taught, and so on. He does refer to himself as I. But then again, in the general Madhyamika context, we always say, yes, but everybody always talks about an I. But that's just what we would call a mere self. That's just, you can say, conventional. The real issue at hand is whether or not we take this conventional self as being solid. You could say independent, permanent. That's where there's you could say some basis for discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
How do donations and say you've been eating meat for a long time, and then you decided to atone somehow and donate, so to donate to causes that have animals, or do things that are active things that benefit. So how does it come into play into the idea of purification?
Well, that's sort of more, yeah. So the question is, if one, for example, has been eating meat for a long time, and then all of a sudden one decides one doesn't want to do that, and in addition, one wants to atone for that. I don't know what you could say traditional answer is to this. All I can say from my own perspective, as you're asking the question, I just think, first of all, to actually regret that one had been eating meat, then the 4 powers apply. And then in addition, if you then make donation to, let's say, charities, then that accumulates merit. So I think atonement, I don't know if we would use the word atonement as much, but more sort of, yes. Yeah, purification would
purify your karma somehow.
Yeah, a way of purifying. We would always say with regards to negative actions that they have one quality. All negative actions have one quality, and that is they can be purified. So with the 4 actions we purify, but then in addition we can of course accumulate merit through in supporting.
Part of regret.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It goes into the regret element. So there is an active activity.
Yes.
Follow,
Yeah.
Seal it better.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see if there's any. No, that's it. All right. Thank you very much for joining here today. And like I was saying earlier, not many of you are monastics, but some of you are actually. Occasionally in the room here, I see there are monastics. So this is something that applies for us. And we would always say also, this even applies nowadays. Dingo Rinpoche would say this about the modern world. He says it's really important that there are monastics, and it's really the foundation of the Dharma. So while some of these vows obviously don't apply to us, nevertheless, it actually reflects, you could say, the depth and the involvement and the profound commitment of the monastics. So it's good for us to get some little bit of a rough idea of what this monasticism involves. Okay, we'll conclude with dedication. Let's just see. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So thank you very much, and greetings from this little retreat here in Lombardia in Italy. All the best. See you next week.
Thank you.